And in my opinion, this is also the most fun thing that you do in the class. So we'll talk about some logistics. Before I get started, the last homework is going to be released hopefully today, maybe tomorrow, worst case, but I think it's essentially good to go. We just have to make the Gradescope version of it, and then the TAs and I are going to start grading assignments 1 and 2. I think the latest deadlines that I gave for people, I gave extensions to some students. The last one is, I think, today. So we should be able to get those grades out hopefully by early next week, maybe Monday or so. Don't quote me on that. And then assignment 3 is due on Sunday. It's the easiest assignment you'll have, so it shouldn't take too long. Assignment 4 will have significantly more programming than assignment 3, but it's not particularly bad. And we have some pretty good documentation and like walkthroughs within the markdown, so it should be a good assignment. Okay, so let's talk about final projects. One thing I wanted to bring up is that I have officially acquired the OpenBCI Cytons and the corresponding caps and stuff. I'm actually going to pick them up and check them out today, and I'm going to take them into the lab space. So my goal starting week 7 is to have 3 contiguous hours every single day for people to go into that lab space and be able to either collect in there with their own EEG equipment if they have it, or to use the OpenBCI Cyton. So this will include being, trained on how to collect the data initially, and then once you're trained to collect it, you can start collecting whenever you want. So I'm aiming for that starting week 7. I'm also going to try to plan some more coordinated lab exercises, but I'm not exactly sure when that's going to happen. That's sort of a side goal, so if it doesn't happen, it's okay. But yes, the goal is to be in the lab as long as possible so that people can get trained to collect EEG data and essentially have 15 hours a week when they could do it if their group is, based around that. So essentially somebody has to be in the room, an experimenter has to be in the room, a teaching person has to be in the room so you can use the equipment. So you can use that during my office hours or my lab hours, as I'll call them, as well as during the TA's office hours. And I'll train them on simple debugging and stuff for the equipment. And if you're considering using the lab space for your projects, then I'm going to send out a Google form, which is going to be an availability thing, just so I can see roughly when people would be free to use the equipment, because I don't want to just be in that room for 3 hours doing nothing. I want people to actually use it, so I'll pull for that. Okay, now I'm supposed to go through the syllabus. This is when my decision not to use my second monitor is going to hurt me. But okay, so I wanted to talk about the final projects, and so we can start on what I have on the syllabus. So one of the key things here is that the group should be between 1 and 6 people. The reason why there's a penalty for having just a single person is honestly just because this is a big class and we just can't grade 200 individual projects. But it's also the first time where we've had this class where you're not allowed to do literature reviews, which are traditionally done by single-person groups. And that's just because, in my opinion, most people think that the literature review is the easiest option, and so they leave it to the last minute. But if you do a good literature review, it's actually one of the hardest options. And so because of that, a lot of students would end up getting really low grades doing the literature review because they severely underestimate what we expect of a literature review, even though we meet with them and tell them. So I just took that option out completely. And with that, I think it eliminates most good arguments for a single-person project. I wanted to keep the option alive because there are some people that come into the class with a lot of background already, and they're able to just hit the ground running and do a really good project. So when I took this class as an undergrad, I did a single project, and a lot of my research assistants that I've gotten from this class have done individual projects. So I know it's a very good opportunity for people who are already ready to shine even brighter. And I want that option to continue existing. So just know that if you do that, I'm going to expect you to put more time than you would if you were working with a group. And I'll count that as like, yeah, essentially if you're doing a single project, I'm grading you as if you're 2 people. So just keep that in mind. And then this is less important to talk about right now. We'll talk about it towards the end of the projects, but you will have to comment on other people's projects, and everything that you make is going to be posted on Piazza so that students can grade your projects and check things out. So just keep that in mind. You're not just making things for the TAs and I, you're making it for all of your other classmates of this year and then maybe even the subsequent years, because we do share previous year's projects. So let's go over, you can consider this a rough draft of the rubric that we'll use to grade. These are sort of any project in any class that is similar to this should be somewhat similar to this rubric, so it shouldn't be very surprising content. Obviously, one of the most important things is to have a clear goal, hypothesis, or question, and then also state the motivation behind that project idea. This one should be pretty self-explanatory, but you should be able to essentially identify an interesting project that is related to the class and explain why you're motivated to tackle that, or why it would be important for somebody to tackle this for society or the future or whatever. You can get creative with that. Okay? Clear definition of data collection procedures. This is obviously only going to apply to the groups that are planning on collecting their own data. If you're not doing that, then this doesn't apply. But essentially, if you're planning on, for example, creating a BCI, if you actually want to make a real-time system, then you're going to need to clearly detail what you did to collect those data and why you did it that way. So if you're designing your training phase in a certain way, explain why you did it. If you're using like Unreal or Unity for whatever task, explain why you did that. Explain which electrodes you chose, so on and so forth. So this is pretty critical. This just shows that you were able to think through your problem well and made good decisions in terms of what you needed to try to accomplish your project. Every project must include at least one visualization of neural data. This is honestly just good practice in general. It can be sometimes attractive, especially if you're doing deep analysis or just deep classification, to run all your data through the pipeline and just see what the classification results are at the end. But you always want to make sure that what you're doing is neurally plausible. So if you're, for example, extracting epochs from different classes, it's a good idea to just plot the averaged activity from both of those classes together, just to make sure as a sanity check that your data are behaving the way that you expect them to. So this at least one visualization you should just get for free due to best practices, but I'm making it a requirement, and hopefully that ends up saving some people from mistakes they would have otherwise made. So yeah, examples would be single trial or averaged ERPs. You could also have power spectrum plots for the Fourier transform if you're doing something like motor imagery or SSVEP. You could do time frequency analysis, which is sort of a combination of the two. You could look at the effects of filtering and artifact correction. So let's say you apply some sort of blink removal, or you use ICA, which we'll talk about next week. Then it could be good to say, okay, show a plot of this is what our data looked like before applying this artifact rejection or correction. This is what it looks like afterwards. And then you need clear motivation behind your pre-processing and feature extraction. This doesn't have to necessarily be profound. It could just be, I filtered the data with this bandpass because, according to the literature, this is a very common set of filters to use. We're not interested in activity higher than 30 hertz, and we apply a high-pass filter to get rid of our drift, yada, yada, yada. And then feature extraction, again, it depends on what the goal of the project is. This might actually be nothing. Like, let's say you're just trying to do an offline study where you're collecting the P300 with the Cyton. You just want to see if it's possible. That's an interesting project. So you don't necessarily have to do this feature extraction step at the end, right? You can just say, okay, we've pre-processed our data, we've set our epochs to this, we use this filter, and now we're plotting the ERPs. You can stop there. So this feature extraction is only necessary if you're then going to go and apply some sort of classification or other statistics to the data. So if you're going to drop data or subjects from a data set, you should clearly motivate that. Think of this as if, I am a reviewer of an article and I'm trying to make sure that you're doing everything by the book. I don't want you to be p-hacking, I don't want you to be cherry-picking data, so you should justify any sort of changes you make to the data set. Also, the channels that you end up utilizing should be justified. If you decide to use every channel in a data set, for example, in assignment 3, we use every single channel for our classification accuracy, it's okay to just make sure that your data are free from artifacts. But if you wanted to, for example, say, okay, I'm just going to use electrodes PZ and CPZ, then you could justify that by saying, okay, we know that the P3B is maximal at electrodes PZ and CPZ, and we thought that there's, by having so many different data, having so many different dimensions, we increase our variance of our data set, and we don't have that much data. So as a way of dimensionality reduction, we chose a subset of channels, something like this. Or you could do an automated approach and say that, we took this automated approach, such as, particle swarm or whatever, to figure out that these are the channels that give us the most information, and that's why we chose these channels. Something like that. And yeah, in general, I do want to, if you decide to take something very experimental, so like let's say you're like, oh, I've taken these electrical engineering classes, I have these ideas about these types of filters that I don't really necessarily see with this type of data. I'm curious what would happen. That's super awesome. Highly recommend you do that. Just make sure that you explain why you're doing it and what led you to those steps. It just needs to be plausible. It doesn't necessarily have to be, you don't have to just redo something that people have done or stay down the beaten path. You're welcome to explore. We just want to make sure you're doing things that are sensible given the context. So if you are planning on doing some more experimental stuff, I highly recommend meeting with myself and the TAs sooner rather than later. Okay, if you're doing mostly classification, or if you're just applying classifiers at the end stage for a BCI that you're making, for example, then you need to clearly explain the motivation behind your classifiers. So for example, if you're making a P3 speller, or you're working with a P3 speller competition data set, and you decide you want to use like EEGNet for that problem, then you should explain, what EEGNet does and why you think it's appropriate to use in this case. It's not really sufficient to just say, okay, this is interesting, unless your project is like testing a bunch of different classifiers on a bunch of different data sets, for example. Like if your goal is to see, okay, what is the best classifier for a general set of EEG problems, then you can maybe get away with saying, okay, I'm using EEGNet and support vector machines and dual augmented Lagrangian and LDA, whatever, because these are very commonly cited, and we think that the properties of the data that we're working with fit those, but it can't just be, I'm using these algorithms because I think they're interesting, or because why not? So you have to show some sort of understanding of the classifiers that you're choosing. And yeah, this last point is important. It's not recommended to simply throw existing data sets at deep neural networks without appropriate motivation or understanding, which sometimes those projects get pitched, which is why I'm saying it. I get it, neural networks are cool and exciting, but you should think about what you're doing. It shouldn't just be, okay, this is fancy, fun stuff. Let me just throw data at it. That doesn't help anybody. Okay. Results should be shown and explained clearly with the use of statistics or visualizations. This could be as simple as, let's say you're doing a P3 study with the Cyton, it could just be showing the grand average plots of target versus non-target ERPs. It could just be, let's say you have two different groups of people, let's say you record from some people that are very good at video games and some people that are very bad at video games. So this is a project that people have done in this class before. Then you could just do group level, t-tests between those groups to see if there's any statistical difference between, their alpha activity while they're playing this game across groups, something like that. So that's why I say and or in the stats and visualizations. Ideally, you'd have both, but they're not strictly required. It depends on the type of problem you're doing. If you're doing just classification, for example, you could show the an ROC plot, which we generate in assignment 3, as a way of showing, okay, this is how our classifier performs. Or you could show, training loss over a number of iterations or whatever heuristic you have for assessing the performance of your classifier. And again, you can talk to us about which visualizations or stats might be appropriate for your project. We're happy to help with that. And then finally, a discussion and conclusion. This is a very important section because what ends up happening is you create a project that some of the pieces start working, but you're not able to get something that works 100%. And so the conclusion is the time where you have to say all the effort that you put into it, why things didn't work, what you would do if you had more time, what things would work in an ideal situation, if you had more data, whatever. This is just your chance to show that you really did churn through this problem and you tried your best, but talk about what you've learned, talk about the shortcomings. This is a good segment. Even in my project, which I will share the presentation that I had when I was an undergrad in this class. My project didn't work. It's fine, and a lot of things go wrong unexpectedly when you're making these projects. So it's okay. You can tell when somebody tries, but just from the discussion and conclusion alone. So it's important. Cool. So I have some example past final projects here. I'm gonna publish on Piazza a list to previous year's presentations. So there's spreadsheets where every group has like a short description of their project and also a link to their final presentation, whether that's a paper or a video presentation. And oftentimes these groups also release their code. So if you're making like a BCI or doing an analysis, a lot of other groups have done similar things, and a lot of groups have piggybacked off of previous year's code as well. So it's totally okay to do that. Again, not every group makes their code public, but most of them do. But yeah, so here are some examples using EEG headsets to brain wrestle. That one's pretty interesting. Using EEG headset to monitor performance during video gameplay. This is a very common goal, and I love this. I'm a big fan of integrating EEG in gaming, so if you do one of these projects, I will happily advise that. Using EEG headsets to give special power-ups during a video game. So at least with the NeuroSky headsets, they're not very good, and they can give you, this measure of relaxation or attention or something. And a lot of groups initially want to try to use this to control something. So, okay, I'm saying it right now, you are not allowed to make a Flappy Bird clone that is controlled by a BCI. I've banned this last year, and the years that I haven't banned it, there's like 12 Flappy Bird clones. You're not allowed to do it. They suck. It's not fun. You essentially, in these cases, when you're working with a simple heuristic like concentration or relaxation, it's such a bad control signal because it varies so much. So if you're trying to use somebody concentrating or somebody relaxing to make the bird jump or not jump, you're just going to get like false positives and false negatives all the time, and it ends up not being a fun experience for anybody. The thing that we suggest doing instead, if you want to actually integrate neural data with these games, is to use it to augment something in a game. So for example, I had a group that did a Space Invader clone where when you were in a regular state of activity, so let's say you're relaxed or just not attent, the game plays perfectly fine. It's just normal Space Invader. But when you get into a high enough threshold of attention, so you're really focused on the game, then you get special bullets that go through multiple enemies. And they also spread. So it's like now you're not shooting just one bullet, you're shooting 3, and all of them do the sort of piercing damage. So that's cool because the game is still playable, it's still fun without the BCI system. And then as the user, you feel strictly rewarded for doing well, for being in this high concentration state. And it makes the game more fun. I've also seen groups do that with Super Mario clones, where your fireball gets stronger, or you can start getting like a level up, get more HP by staying in a high concentration state for a while. So that is a fun way to integrate these systems with games. There are definitely unfun ways to do it, and I would like to steer you away from doing that. But yeah, you can do general performance across groups. You can do classification on EEG competition data sets. So, we've worked with one competition data set in assignment 3. We're going to work with another competition data set in assignment 4. And there are tons of other BCI competition data sets. There's also a bunch of open neuro data sets. So open neuro is a website where people can publish their neurologically recorded data. Sometimes it's EEG, sometimes it's MEG or fMRI. That's a great way to find data sets. In general, I would have you steer clear from Kaggle, because most of the time Kaggle data sets are garbage. They're either poorly documented or the data are just recorded very poorly. We've had more trouble with groups working on Kaggle data sets than any other repository of data. So if you're planning on working with Kaggle, really, really take a look at the data, pitch it to us very clearly. We will take a look at the data set before you actually get started. That's part of why we're having you do this midterm project proposal. But just in general, steer clear from Kaggle and look towards the BCI competition data sets or something like Open Neuro. You can always try novel classifications, novel signal processing. There's no upper bound on these, so it's up to your training and your creativity on that. Okay. And then the grading can be kind of difficult because everybody comes into this class with different backgrounds and people work on vastly different projects. We try to be as fair as possible, but one thing that helps us a lot is for you to actually come into office hours and meet with us so that we know how you're progressing through these projects and know how you're processing this information. I've had students who get into this class that can barely program, so if they're able to save neural data to a CSV and then run some t-tests on that, that's like a massive technological accomplishment for them. But then I also have students who come into this class that have multiple deep learning papers published already. So it's there's there's a lot of variety. So we obviously will take your experience into account, or at least we'll try to. And again, the goal of the project and this class in general is never to penalize you for doing something poorly. It's always to reward you for trying and doing something well, or trying to do things correctly and just thinking through these problems. This is a very difficult and interdisciplinary field, so we don't expect you to be genius savants that are cranking out publication-ready projects in a few weeks. So yeah, we'll try to be fair, but it makes it easier if you guys meet with us and interact with us. And also just make sure that you respect the project and don't try to do it like the last week, which sometimes it works out for students, but I wouldn't recommend it. And again, a working final product is not required. Your main goal is to demonstrate understanding of the course material and to demonstrate significant effort has been committed to the course in the form of the project. This is our main way of assessing whether or not you've participated in this class and the material as a whole, since we don't have tests and the programming assignments are mostly designed just to get you ready for the final project. So I don't really consider them true assessments. Okay. Let's get out of syllabus time. So now I'm going to go over the midterm proposal, and I'm also going to go through bullet points step by step, and I'm also going to walk you through a hypothetical midterm project proposal. So it's actually really fun to come up with a little project idea, and in this made-up world, it's the TAs and I are in a group, and I'll walk you through our hypothetical projects while we go along. So the first is obviously clear goal or hypothesis. This is going to be the first thing you state in your final project. It's going to be the first thing you should state in your midterm. This is just the meat of what are you doing and why. So in our example, we'd like to make a hybrid BCI where we use motor imagery to move the cursor left or right, just like in the Hexos spell. But instead of using the foot motor imagery to select the correct stimulus, we'd like to use double blinks. So, we think that it's going to be faster and easier for us to classify if somebody blinks twice than it would be for us to do 3-class motor imagery classification. That's our hypothesis and that's our goal. And this is somewhat real-world valuable because not everybody is completely locked in. So let's say you're quadriplegic and you can still blink, but you can't move your limbs, then we can definitely use the brain as a control signal, and we should also try to leverage any other control signal we can get because it should be easier and faster and more accurate. So something like that. You then have to have an overall idea of the data collection procedures. So this doesn't have to be 100% hashed out. You don't have to say like, I'm going to use this exact timing and I'm going to use these exact filter parameters. If you have a general idea of what you're going to be doing for your task collection, then you should explain those, but we're not necessarily expecting you to have some, publication methods ready section here. It doesn't have to be that good, it just has to be a pretty good idea of what you're planning on doing. So if you're doing a peer analysis project, you should identify the data set that you're planning on working with. So again, we expect you to choose the data set before making this midterm proposal. You can't just say, oh, I'm interested in doing motor imagery data analysis. That's not good enough. Pick a data set. And you should also make sure that when you pick that data set, it ties into that motivation clearly. So sometimes students will have a general idea, but then they'll pick a data set that's not quite, it doesn't quite match that goal. Like there's not really enough parameters for them to do what they wanted to do. So just, consider this iterative. So think of an idea, look for data sets. It's okay to then change that idea when you're going through this step and be like, oh, actually, this data set has these things that I'm thinking are more interesting. Then go and revise your goals and hypotheses, whatever. Iterate through all of these things, and you don't have to do them in order. If you're going to be doing data collection, you should detail the overall experiments that you're considering running. So, for example, if you're going to make a speller, explain the task design. If you're going to record people playing games, explain how you're going to synchronize the events with your EEG streams, for example, which is non-trivial, and I'm happy to help you with. Let me go through the example for the TAs and I's project. So for our project, we're going to use the OpenBCI Cyton, and we're going to use the cap that we have access to in the class, and we're going to record from, we have access to 8 electrodes plus a reference and a ground, so we're going to record from FP1, and we're also going to use some tape to stick an electrode underneath somebody's eye. We're going to use these 2 electrodes to record blinks, and then we're going to use the other electrodes for capturing motor imagery. We're going to use FPZ as our ground electrode, and we're going to try to use linked mastoids or linked ear clips. We're not sure yet for our reference. So again, it's not totally hashed out. That's okay. We have a general idea of our data collection. We can then talk about the task. We're thinking for the EEG training phase, we'll have a fixation cross, then we'll have a warning symbol. We're not sure if these timings are going to be correct. And then the user is going to be presented with either an L or an R for them to imagine left or right-hand imagery, and then they're going to see a blank screen. And again, it's not exhaustive. We're just saying, okay, we want to create some task where we can create training data where a user is imagining left or right data. But I have created the task. So even if I literally made up these timings, and that's okay. I could have had no timings, and something like this would have been okay as well. And maybe we also think we need to create some blinking training data sets, so we'll modify that task, just have a fixation cross, and then tell the user to blink twice, and then we'll just repeat that a bunch of times. We're not sure how many trials we'll need. And our general pipeline that we're thinking is we'll use the lab streaming layer to send our EEG data to lab recorder, and we'll also use PyLSL to send event markers to lab recorder, and that's how we're going to synchronize our data. But we also don't trust that the LSL streams are going to be fully synchronized, so we're going to use a photo sensor that's going to be connected to the OpenBCI Cyton so that we can also synchronize to the onset of visual stimuli. I wouldn't expect most people to suggest this, but if you do, kudos. But again, this could change. Like maybe we decide at some point to use something like BCI Lab or BrainFlow or OpenVibe or something. This is just right now, this is our general idea. It's okay if it changes. And then for our all-night task, we want to use a replica of the Hexo spell. And we found an open source version of this, or we can say, Q is a wizard at PsychoPy or Unity, and so she really wants to build this task. So we're pretty confident we'll build it. Okay? And then for the online phase, we're just going to use PyLSL again in order to integrate between our task and our EEG data. Beautiful. And we're going to try to synchronously classify our data. So we're not going to make an asynchronous BCI. We're going to go for synchronous because we think asynchronous will be too hard. Cool. So again, that was kind of a lot, but this is where the bulk of your midterm proposal should be. It should be in the general steps that you're planning on undertaking, right? You're trying to tell us what project you're doing, so we want you to focus a lot on how you think you're going to be able to do it. And then you should identify the key challenges in completing your project and how the project relates to the course objectives. Again, this is designed to be iterative, so you don't have to do these bullet point, bullet point, bullet point, bullet point. Let's say you do all the first three or the first two and you get here and you're just like, oh, actually this seems like it might be too hard. That's fine. That's, again, why this is designed. I want you guys to be thinking about these things when you're deciding on your project. So if you decide it's too hard, go back and revise. You know, maybe we say, okay, actually, it might be too work to make this thing, so we're just going to ask the original authors for their code or something like that. I think that would be a fair modification. So let's look at the example. Our example challenges is having a time window that is trying to determine motor imagery or double blinks might be confounding. So like, let's say we only have one region in time where we're trying to see, okay, is the user double blinking or is the user thinking left or right hand imaging or left or right hand imagery? It might be like we might get some false positives. We're not sure what to prioritize. Maybe we'll just say that, okay, if we detect double blinking, that trumps if we detect motor imagery. But we're not sure if that'll work. And then getting clean enough data with just a few electrodes might be difficult. And we can't leverage the things we learned in class, such as common spatial patterns or current source density or common average referencing, because we just don't have that many electrodes. So we're sort of not sure if this is going to work because we have very few electrodes. However, you know, we've seen some competition data sets that use like 2 electrodes for motor imagery, so we think it might be possible. And we'll reference those previous approaches to try to make our performance better. And we're not sure how we can use our bipolar channels because we have electrodes on either side of C3 and C4, but we'd like to find some way to incorporate that information because we remember from Blankert's paper that that was better than just using the raw power spectrum. And we also are not really sure what algorithms we're going to use for blink detection. We haven't studied blinks in class, but we feel like blinks should be pretty easy to record, so we're just going to wing it. I don't know. That part might not work. Okay. So again, in this example proposal, not all the details are totally hashed out, but the group is identifying a general sense of what they want to do and also identifying potential pitfalls that they think they can surmount. It's not like there should be nothing in this challenges thing that is like a project killer, you know? If you list like, oh, you know, none of us are good at programming, so we might not be able to do this, that would be, if you write that down and you present it, you have failed the, like you failed to understand what this is about, you know? You should, if you get to that point, you write these slides, somebody in the group should be, okay, wait a minute, I think maybe we should do a different project. And we should never get a proposal that's like, yeah, this is not going to be possible for us to do. These are just things that might be difficult to overcome. And then, very importantly, we want to see a clear division of labor. This is honestly, I think, something that a lot of students overlook because they want to work with their friends. Like, let's say, you know, you have a bunch of your friends in this class and you guys just want to do a project together. What ends up happening a lot of these times is people end up having not enough work to do, or everything gets bottlenecked. So like, let's say, oh, we want to make this, and I've seen groups like this where it's like, we want to make a BCI that controls a robotic arm. And it's a 6-person group, and one person is designing the arm, and like one person is trying to do the, like implement the real-time BCI stuff, and then everybody else is just like waiting to like have a task assigned to them, or, you know, one, like let's say the person finishes the online pipeline, but then the dude never builds the robotic arm. Everybody is just waiting for this one person to finish this part of the task before they can move forward. So you want to try to identify potential bottlenecks. You want to make sure that the goals that you have are something that requires the number of people that you have in your group. It's okay to, you know, have a group of friends and think of an idea, and then while you're brainstorming, split off into 2 separate groups and just collaborate with each other. That's fine. Like, like let's say, you know, let's say we're all a bunch of gamers and we want to see how people's brains are different when they're playing Dota or something. And me and two of my friends are like, oh, actually, Dota sucks. Let's study League of Legends instead. And then my other friends are like, no, Dota's way better than League. And so then you end up saying, okay, let's agree to disagree. You guys study Dota, we'll study League, and we'll share our methods with each other and like try to do an actual comparison of these two things, but we'll collaborate. Something like that would be awesome. Like, it'd be great to have this collaborative across group things. Every year we have multiple groups that are trying to use music for a studying aid or trying to classify which genre of music somebody is listening to. Those groups should talk to each other. And like, we've tried to put them together before so that they can talk about the different pitfalls. Like, oh, we're seeing more of a difference if we have really high BPM differences. So if we're listening to something that's just like an 80 BPM sonata or something and like 320 BPM Euro jungle or something, it's like you might expect to see some differences in the EEG data from such different music, But like, this is something that some groups don't necessarily think about. So it's good to talk to other groups that are working on similar things. And again, if at some point you feel like there's just not enough work for your group, you can always split up. You can always, or you could always change the division of labor. So you could say, okay, it's actually taking this person longer than they expected to make their experiment. So let's throw another person that was sort of waiting for the analysis pipeline to be done and just say, okay, learn how to make this experiment with this person, something like that. So this division of labor doesn't have to be set in stone. We just want to see that you're thinking about how the project is going to work and how your team is going to work. And we will help you to reassess this after the proposal. Again, that's the point of the midterm proposal. It doesn't have to be perfect. We just want you to get a pretty good idea of what you're going to do, and then we'll help you refine it. So in our example project, we'll have, Q is going to be in charge of creating behavioral experiments. And everyone has a second bullet point. We're all going to be working on integrating things into the online version of the task. That's going to be the hardest thing, but it's going to need all of us to do our parts in order to get this working. But yeah, Q is mostly going to be in charge of the PsychoPy stuff because she's a PsychoPy wizard. Srini is going to be in charge of machine learning because he's a machine learning wizard. Ina is going to be in charge of the main offline analysis and also creating the training data set in order to send it to the machine learning stuff because she's an analysis wizard. And Ollie is going to be in charge of setting up the data collection and the online pipeline because he's a data collection wizard, So don't just say everybody's a wizard as a thing. But you could explain, like Q's been making PsychoPy experiments since she was 3 years old, and Srini invented machine learning, and Ina pioneered signal processing. It didn't exist before her. And literally nobody collected data until I started collecting data. Yeah, don't say that either, but, Okay, and then the last thing is some sort of timeline for how you're planning on accomplishing these tasks. This is non-trivial because, for example, I'll show you the example. We're going to start on week 7, right? We're not going to start this project before that because we have midterms and I'm anticipating a funeral in my family and whatever. So starting week 7, Q is going to start working on motor imagery tasks in PsychoPy. Srini is going to start reading about classification algorithms for low density motor imagery. Ina is going to look back at previous analysis code that we used on the homeworks to try to make a pipeline. And Ollie is going to start reading about lab streaming layer and real-time BCIs. Starting week 8, Q is going to make the simple blink task just so we can record some blink data because that seems like it'll be easier than the EEG data. Srini is going to start implementing the machine learning pipeline, and he's pretty confident that that he found a competition data set that is going to allow him to start building that pipeline while we're still getting ready to collect data. This right here, this is key. If you have a group like this that's planning on doing an online BCI, and you have a set of people that are working on just the classification stuff, you do not want them to be bottlenecked by the data collection team because I'm just going to spoil it for you. Collecting data is a lot harder than you're thinking it's going to be. It's difficult to set up a good experiment. It's difficult to record high-quality EEG. I will do my best to help you because I've been doing this for like 7 years, but even then, it might just not work out. and you don't want your analysis team to be waiting exclusively for you to collect some data to do something. So if that team or that person is able to find a data set that's similar enough to what you're trying to do, then it would be a really good idea for them to play around with that and use that to test the pipeline. So for example, I know for a fact there are multiple BCI lab or BCI competitions that use sparse channel motor imagery. So they have like 2 or 3 channels, but also let's say you can't find a sparse one for what you're trying to do, but you find one that has like 128 channels. Okay, just drop all of the channels except for the ones that you're planning on using and see if you can get good classification algorithm with, you know, the optimal number of electrodes, but also see if you can change it to use just the electrodes you have for your experiment. And then Ina will start modifying the analysis pipeline for the type of data that we'll collect. So maybe we've identified the format of our data and the sampling rate, and we've sort of decided on maybe we think these filters are going to be appropriate. So we can start modifying existing code that we had from the past or from homework and start using that. And then Ollie is going to try to record some example double blink data from Q's blink task and then send that to Ina and Trini so that they can start seeing how those data are going to work. And then week 9, start working on real-time hexospell with Ollie. Trini is hopefully going to be done with the double blink detector, and he's going to finish the motor imagery pipeline. Ina is going to process the motor imagery data that Ollie collects from the task, and is going to extract the feature. And Ollie is going to collect some motor imagery data, send that to Ina, and then work on the online pipeline with Q using Ina's code. Okay? And then, week 10, you'd say, let's actually try to record the online BCI, and then the days up to the final, we just work on the presentation, something like that. So in theory, this timeline sounds good, but it has some issues. So we'll analyze it. In general, it's a good proposal. It's an interesting project. It's obviously very related to the class. It's a motor imagery speller. You're trying to create it with sparse electrodes. That's cool. The division of labor is pretty solid. There's not that many bottlenecks. People always seem to have something that they can work on independent of somebody else until the end, which that makes sense. After all, it is a group project. If you had no interaction with the other teammates, then you're not really doing a group project, So there's going to be some trading off of tasks and expectations that somebody's going to be done with this at some point. You just don't want everything to be hinged on single things happening, which is why we call them bottlenecks. It definitely relates to the course material. It utilizes data collection and analysis of competition data sets, and it aims to make a real-time BCI. The weakness, and this should be maybe less obvious to you, but obvious to me since I've seen a bunch of proposals and seen a bunch of projects, but this is almost certainly not possible to be done in this amount of time, given the skills of most undergraduate, even talented undergraduate students, right? So we know that you're taking other classes, you have other responsibilities, so you probably don't have the time to spend, 10 hours every day trying to make a real-time BCI for this class. And maybe if you do, it's not necessarily the case that everybody else in your team has the exact same time dedication. So you should really assess your timing with other courses, and you should assess how relevant your previous experience and comfort is with the tasks that you're trying to do. So like in my example that I gave, like maybe actually like the real people, Q, Srini, Ina, and I could do this in this amount of time because, we're all graduate students, we've been doing this stuff for years. But even then, this would be kind of a tight timeline because we all have our other work and our teaching responsibilities and our other research projects. So even in a scenario where everybody is totally qualified and able to do this in this timeline, it still might be hard to do it in such a tight timeline because of life, So just be pragmatic with that. A suggestion that we might give for something like this is we might say, okay, just drop the real-time portion of it. Try doing just the offline stuff because trying to do all of that and then also cram getting it working into real time and debugging all of the issues we have with real-time processing might not be feasible. And maybe if progress goes really well, you would squeeze online in. And maybe if your experience was if you were less experienced of a group, we might even suggest, okay, get rid of the double blink classifier. Let's see if you can just make an offline classifier for left and right motor imagery. Like even that would be interesting. You can start off with this very high goal and we can say, okay, this is good, but like let's try to make it reasonable. Make this your goal, and if you can accomplish that fast enough, maybe move on to the fun stuff. So this is sort of just the bullet points of the midterm proposal. It should address all the points that we just listed. 4 to 5 minute asynchronous video presentation. The ideal layout is to have every group member discuss their part during the presentation. We'd also like to be able to see your faces and your names so we can start pairing faces and names to projects. The timeline slide doesn't have to be talked through the way I talked about it. It can just be the table. And it's not really necessarily important to go over every little thing. We just want to be able to assess that your timeline is somewhat feasible. Please don't speed up your video. I hate it when students do this because I'm probably going to speed up your video already. So don't make it even faster. Just practice concisely writing up and presenting your information. This is a skill that will help you no matter what you end up doing in your life. I guarantee being able to concisely explain your ideas is good. Not every detail has to be completely hashed out. We're not expecting this to be the final project presentation. It's just a proposal for the project. Just do your best, think these problems through, iterate over things. You should definitely talk to people in office hours if you can. We'd love to hear your ideas. We'd love to help you iterate. I've already had people come to office hours and talk about their ideas or email me about ideas. So just keep doing that. I'd also like to talk about some brainstorming tips. So I will release the spreadsheet of previous projects. This is great to go through, read through their presentations or watch their presentation videos, go through their source code, see what types of data sets people work with and what problems they've had with those data sets. I'll also highlight a few of the ones that are like A+ projects. You can start from ideas that we've talked about in the class, and if you want to sort of see how to iterate over these ideas, you can take a paper, go into Google Scholar, and see which papers have cited that paper, and you might find some, like, for example, pretty much every motor imagery and CSP analysis paper has cited the Blankert's paper, so you could click, see who cited that, and see what the most recent paper on that is, and see how crazy the field has gone, and use that for inspiration. It's also highly encouraged to talk about your general thoughts in office hours, since we can definitely help you brainstorm. And then tips for finding a group. Piazza is great. Discord is great. I'm not on Discord, and I don't think any of the other TAs are, so just feel free to interact there. We're not moderating you or anything. But find a teammate on Piazza is really useful. We can also do a meet and greet in person if students think it would be helpful. Actually, let me quickly pull for this because we're running low on time. So I'm going to do just an in-person poll right now for those that are interested in filling this out and are here. So just simply yes or no, would you want to do an in-person meet and greet during class? This isn't super, I hate this website. Okay, hold up. Restart current question. So yeah, it's not super critical to get this answer right now. I'm going to put a poll on Piazza so that everybody can answer it, but I just wanted to see, of the people that are synchronously attending and could theoretically make it in person, would you be interested in having dedicated time to meet other people who are also synchronous? And then, go ahead and start from the beginning, Google Slides, well done. Okay. It's either way, going to office hours is good because there might be other people talking about their project ideas that you can relate to and you think that's interesting and you might want to work with them. And it's a very good idea to be transparent about your scheduling and your other commitments when you're looking for a group. So let's say you're able to come to class synchronously during this time, or maybe you can work on Zoom during this time. That's great because starting week 7, you have the rest of the quarter at this time to work with your group. We're giving you guaranteed time to meet with people, but some people can only take this class asynchronously, so you just be transparent about your schedules. And yeah, that's about it. I try to squeeze everything into that. I'm sure I missed some stuff, but feel free to ask questions on Piazza and we can elaborate there. Overall, just start thinking about your project ideas now. We're going to officially release the midterm project proposal next week, and then it's going to be due week 6. All right, thanks everyone.